The disinfectant wipe paused on one armrest, then stopped. Not the tray table, not the neighboring seat. Only 1A. I noticed because nothing else in the first-class cabin paused that way. Boarding moved in a steady rhythm. Jackets are made of brushed leather. Overhead bins closed in sequence. Voices lowered as people reached the front and adjusted themselves to the order already assigned. He entered last. A black man. Tall. Broad through the shoulders. Wearing a plain grey hoodie and worn boots. No logos. No noise. A leather duffel hung from his hand. The kind softened by years of use. He did not scan the cabin for reactions. He walked straight down the aisle. Eyes forward. As if the space had already accepted him. Rebecca Cole stepped into the aisle before he reached the bulkhead. She did not block him fully. She rested one hand on the back of seat 1A instead. The posture suggested procedure. Not confrontation. Just wait here a moment, she said. Eyes on her tablet. I need to confirm something. Tonight in Sade, the man stopped. Not because he was told to, but because the aisle had narrowed around him. Passengers behind slowed, then froze. A businessman in 1B glanced up, then back down at his phone. Rebecca's finger moved across the seat map. She looked at the screen, then at the man, then back to the screen. Her voice softened. Not warmer, just flatter. This seat may have been reassigned. Ido. She did not ask for his boarding pass. She did not say his name. She kept her hand on the seat, as if holding it in place. The man reached into his pocket and waited. He did not interrupt. He stood there, duffel resting against his leg, shoulders square, blocking the aisle without meaning to. Rebecca took the paper when he offered it. She scanned it quickly, eyes darting for qualifiers. Standby. Upgrade. Anything temporary. There were none. She handed it back and stepped aside. Go ahead. A. As he sat, she pulled a disinfectant wipe from her pocket and cleaned the armrest. Slow. Deliberate. The wipe stopped at the edge of the cushion. She did not clean the tray. She did not clean 1B. She wiped her fingers afterward. The man adjusted his seat and placed the duffel under the overhead bin. It fit easily. He closed the bin with a soft click and sat back. Hands resting on his thighs, the cabin resumed its rhythm. Rebecca returned to the galley. She leaned toward the junior attendant. Emily Carter. Her voice low enough to stay private. Don't rush service up here. No. Emily nodded. She glanced once toward 1A. The man had put on noise-canceling headphones and closed his eyes. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. Engines wound up, then settled. Outside, the tarmac lights reflected off wet concrete as de-icing delays stacked into quiet minutes. Rebecca moved down the aisle with a tray. Crystal flutes. Sparkling water. She stopped at 1B. Champagne. Mr. Lawson? He accepted. She smiled. She served every seat forward of the wing. When she reached 1A, she did not slow. She did not look down. The tray passed within inches of the armrest she had cleaned earlier. The man remained still. Minutes passed. The cabin warmed slightly as the aircraft waited for its turn. The man opened his eyes and pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded. In the galley. Rebecca glanced at the panel. With 2 quick taps, she silenced it. No announcement. No acknowledgement. He already had his chance. She said, quietly to another attendant. Eyes still on the screen. The man waited. Then, I pressed it again. Nothing. He removed his headphones and looked toward the galley. Rebecca was laughing with someone off-duty in the jump seat. Her back half turned to the cabin. He stood. Not abruptly. just enough to stretch, as others had done during long ground holds. He stepped into the aisle and walked toward the galley. Duffel untouched. Posture steady. Rebecca turned as he approached. The aisle narrowed again. By the time he spoke, the engines were still idling. The aircraft still. The cabin silent enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Excuse me," he said. "I've been trying to get some water." Lighted, Rebecca stepped forward, closing the space between them. The systems above them continued to hum, unaware that something small, procedural, and irreversible had already begun. Rebecca Cole stepped closer, just enough to narrow the galley opening. Not a block, a correction. The engines continued their low, even hum. The aircraft remained still. The aisle behind Jonathan Reed held its breath the way public spaces do when procedure hesitates. "The seatbelt sign is on," Rebecca said. Jonathan glanced upward. The light was illuminated, unchanged from the last 20 minutes, when passengers had stood, stretched, and returned without comment. He did not point this out. He shifted his weight back, giving her space. "I'm just asking for water," he said. "It's warm back there." Cruise. Rebecca did not reach for a bottle. She did not look at the cooler. She took one step forward instead, placing herself between Jonathan and the counter. "You need to return to your seat." "Vaston." Her voice carried farther than necessary. A few heads turned. The businessman in 1B lowered his magazine. Emily Carter froze near the storage closet, hands clasped too tightly. Jonathan nodded once. He moved to step around her, angling his shoulder toward the wall to avoid contact. His hand lifted slightly toward the counter, where bottled water was visible through clear plastic. Rebecca reacted before the movement finished. Both of her hands came up and made contact with his chest. Not a strike, a shove. Enough force to reset the position. Jonathan's heel slid on the smooth galley floor. He caught himself against the lavatory wall, shoulder striking plastic with a dull sound. The cabin fell silent, the way it does when a sound doesn't belong. He straightened. He brushed the front of his hoodie where her hands had been. The fabric stayed creased. Rebecca inhaled sharply. Her posture shifted again, from forward to defensive. Her voice rose, calibrated to carry. "You can't do that," she said. "You approached me." Well, it was no. "Right." Jonathan looked at her. He did not raise his voice. "You put your hands on me." "Way. I secured the cabin," Rebecca said. The words came quickly. "Practiced. You were being aggressive." Rister. No one spoke. The engines idled. The cabin lights stayed steady. Jonathan reached into his pocket. Rebecca's eyes flicked down, then back up. "What are you doing?" He did not answer immediately. He unlocked his phone. The screen that appeared was not a camera. It required a thumbprint. Then a code. "I'm making a call," he said. "There's no signal," Rebecca replied. "We're wheels up soon." 2. Jonathan lifted the phone to his ear anyway. The line connected. He spoke quietly, voice low enough that only those nearest could hear. Names were exchanged. An authorization code followed. Spoken once, without repetition, he described the situation in simple terms. Location, flight number, nature of contact. "I am requesting an immediate ground hold," he said. "Yes." Ode. He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. Rebecca stared at him. Her mouth opened, then closed. She laughed once, a short sound that didn't land. "That's not how this works," she said. "Sit down." Jonathan turned away from her and walked back to seat 1A. He sat. He buckled his seatbelt. He closed his eyes. The aircraft jolted slightly. Not movement. Absence of it. The engine pitch dropped, then fell silent. The steady hum of airflow disappeared, replaced by the softer vibration of auxiliary power. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Brooks paused mid-checklist. His radio crackled with a voice that was not part of the usual rhythm. Atlantic Regal 909. Cancel taxi clearance. Hold position. Brooks acknowledged. He set the brakes. He exchanged a look with his first officer. Ground stop. The voice continued. Federal directive. Do not move. There. Were to 9. Rebecca felt it then. The shift that does not announce itself but rearranges everything. She turned toward the interphone as it lit up. Cabin. She answered. Rebecca. Captain Brooks said. We're ordered back to the gate. Federal involvement. Do we have a security issue back there? Rebecca glanced toward 1A. Jonathan Reed sat motionless. Eyes closed. Hands resting on his thighs. Yes, she said. She lowered her voice, letting it tremble just enough. Unruly passenger. He approached me in the galley. Physical contact. To one-sided. Understood. Brooks replied. Authorities are meeting us. Keep him seated. Do not engage. And quote. Rebecca ended the call. Her breathing steadied. She smoothed her uniform and stepped into the aisle. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, addressing the cabin. We apologize for the delay. For safety reasons. We're returning to the gate to address a situation. His round. She did not look at Jonathan when she said it. As the aircraft began its slow tow back toward the terminal, red and blue reflections flickered across the cabin walls from somewhere beyond the windows. Passengers craned their necks. Phones appeared, then lowered again. Jonathan opened his eyes and looked out at the tarmac. The lights multiplied. Vehicles are assembled in precise lines. Behind him, the system he had called was already arriving. The jet bridge locked against the aircraft with a heavy thud. Not gentle, not delayed. Rebecca Cole stood at the front of the cabin, hands folded too tightly at her waist. Her eyes stayed on the door. She adjusted her posture, smoothing her uniform, rehearsing a version of events that placed her back in control. The door opened. Not airport police. Not a supervisor with a clipboard. Dark uniforms filled the space. Equipment first, then presence. The kind that doesn't ask questions out loud. Behind them, a man in a suit stepped forward. Badge visible only long enough to be recognized by those who knew what it meant. Rebecca moved toward him. Thank God you're here, she said. The passenger in 1A became aggressive. I had to. A gloved hand stopped her. Not forcefully. Precisely. Ma'am, the man said. Step aside. Where? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. 2 officers entered the aisle. They did not look at the passengers. They did not scan for reactions. Their attention was fixed on seat 1A. Jonathan Reed opened his eyes. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The dynamic shifted without a sound. Judge Reed. The man in the suit said. His posture changed slightly. Respectful. Are you injured? Sir. Rebecca froze. Judge. The word landed without echo, without emphasis. It did not need help. Jonathan shook his head. I'm fine. Intendable. He turned and looked at Rebecca. Not long. Just enough. The threat, he said calmly, is right there. Together. Rebecca spoke all at once. I didn't know who he was. He approached me. I was securing the cabin. You saw how big he is. Eswold. No one responded. A businessman in 1B stood. Michael Lawson. He held up his phone. "I recorded it," he said. "From boarding. From the galley." Oh, he didn't elaborate. He didn't dramatize. An officer took the phone. Another turned to Rebecca. "Rebecca Cole," he said. "You are being detained." And she laughed once. Then again. "This is a misunderstanding. I've been with this airline for 20 years. End quote. Metal clicked. The sound traveled farther than anything else that night. As she was escorted out, Rebecca looked back at the cabin she had controlled for so long. No one met her eyes. Emily Carter stood near the storage closet, pale, shaking. Jonathan paused beside her. "You'll be asked to tell the truth," he said. "That's all." "Okay," she nodded. Hard. Outside the aircraft, the night had filled with vehicles. Lights reflected off wet concrete. The plane sat motionless. A closed system finally exposed. 2 hours later, a replacement aircraft departed. Different crew. Same destination. Jonathan sat in 1A again. This time, a bottle of water waited at his seat before he asked. He drank slowly. The cabin remained quiet. Rebecca did not return to work. The charges moved quickly. Assault under color of authority. False reporting. Civil rights violations. The video removed ambiguity. Her seniority did not apply. Her uniform no longer mattered. The airline issued statements, then policies. Training protocols rewritten. Oversight was added where discretion had been allowed to drift. Rebecca lost her position, then her pension, then her freedom. Emily Carter testified. She kept her job. Later, she was promoted. Jonathan Reed returned to his bench. He still traveled in a hoodie, not as a statement, as a constant. Months later, when the case concluded, the outcome was final. Not loud, not symbolic, procedural, permanent. The system had corrected itself, quietly. If you were in seat 1A, what would you have done? Comment below, share this story, and subscribe to Black CEO Tales for more stories where power reveals itself without warning.